Good evening. Good evening. Oh, are we on? Nope. Are we on yet? Hello? Is it on? Can you hear me? No, not yet. Okay. Kate? Does this one work? We'll make sure that Amanda Henderson's mic works. I'm just doing the welcome. Welcome to Montview Church. My name is Clover Beal, and I'm one of the co-pastors here at Montview. And on behalf of the whole Montview staff, we are so glad you're here. This is a very important topic. How many of you were here at last month's with the, with the God and Country, the frightening film that we all watched together? Thank you for coming back, and thank you for those of you who are here for the first time. So this is a second session in the series on the dangers of white Christian nationalism. And we decided to do this series, a collective group of churches and Temple Micah and other religious organizations came together and said, this is really important information for people to understand so that we educate ourselves, and that we are approaching this not as in partisanship, but as the reality of a powerful ideology that is operating in the United States in powerful ways, that is a threat to our democracy. And Christians need to be accountable for the messages that the community hears. And we also need to be a counter voice to what people think is Christianity. Yes? Yes. So our hope and our goal and our intention is to offer a counter voice to the voices that are speaking too loudly and that media likes to pick up on, that is not fair to the rest of us who are believers in diversity and inclusion and fairness in our democracy. So that's my soapbox and my introduction. I want to thank the people of faith, the congregations and the organizations that have worked together to sponsor this series. St. Thomas Episcopal Church, Park Hill United Methodist Church, Park Hill Congregational UCC, St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, the Colorado Council of Churches, Together Colorado, Temple Micah, the Denver Presbytery, the Episcopal Diocese in Colorado, the Lutheran Advocacy Ministry, the Episcopal Church of the Holy Redeemer, the members of the Reimagining Social Justice Committee of St. John's Cathedral. I hope I didn't miss anyone else. The last session in the 3-month series on white Christian nationalism will be, the speaker will be Dr. Jamar Tisby, who is author of The Color of Compromise and How to Fight Racism. He was here at Montview Church 2 years ago as our Montview Distinguished Lecturer, and he will be returning both as part of this series and again as our 2024 Montview Distinguished Lecturer. Were any of you there when he was here 2 years ago? Wonderful. So he will be here October 26th and 27th. This is free and open to the public. October 26th from 9 a.m. to noon. He will be here doing 3 different lectures, conversations and talks, and then here on Sunday morning, both preaching at both services and doing the adult faith formation hour at 9:30. He's extraordinary. His work on white Christian nationalism is extraordinary. He has become a real public voice in the country at this time. and on behalf of an alternative narrative in Christianity. So we invite you to come, and please invite your friends and neighbors to join us. Okay, bathrooms are out there. You can't do any welcome without telling people where the bathrooms are. They're out in the commons. Go a little bit farther, you'll see them. I want to introduce my colleague, the Reverend Larissa Romero. She is the senior pastor at Park Hill Congregational UCC, and she will introduce our speaker tonight.
Hello. Oh. Good evening. How often have perhaps you said, or I've heard someone else say, I don't come to church to hear politics? Raise your hand. Yes? And there are some incredible people who are called, who run towards that intersection between religion, politics, and culture. And indeed, our esteemed guest this evening is one such person. She has led the way as the director for Iliff School of Theology's Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture, where she works for transformative action rooted in deep understanding by informing public leaders about those most pressing issues we face today, including the topic that we will be hearing about tonight. An ordained Disciples of Christ minister, she has served for 7 years as the director of the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado. She hosts the Complexified podcast, and she is the author of Holy Chaos, Creating Connections in Divisive Times. Beloveds, please join me in welcoming the incredible Reverend Dr. Amanda Henderson.
Thank you. Thanks, Larissa and Clover, for that kind introduction. I'm grateful to be here with you all. Yes, I am that weird person who likes to talk about religion and politics. One of my friends told me recently that I'm the best party favor to bring because I spice up the conversation wherever I am. Actually, I was just in New Orleans with my girlfriends, and at 3 bars, I engaged in deep conversation about who people were voting for who lived in Pennsylvania and Georgia, and we had the best conversations. We hugged at the end, so it is possible. So I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you are learning about this really important issue that is amidst us and a part of us and not going anywhere, and that is white Christian nationalism. I'm glad that everyone watched the film last month when you were together, and as Clover mentioned, it scares you. And so I don't want to scare you. I hope to empower you through this conversation today. And one of the things that we are going to be doing is doing a little bit of a history lesson in how we got here. So, and then there will be time for a question and answer. I appreciate and enjoy conversation. Hopefully I'm still in the light if I'm down here. Is this okay? All right. Okay, so what is Christian nationalism? This is the first thing that we need to answer. Christian nationalism is a modern political movement that idealizes and advocates for a fusion of Christianity and American civic and political life. It's a very intentional political effort. It's also a cultural framework that is both explicit and implicit, that shapes ideals, values, and myths that orient who we are as Americans and shapes our identity and belonging and who we want to be based on social hierarchies. Christian nationalism is not, and I know this group all knows these things, it is not biblical. There was no story of America in the Bible. It's not based on the teachings of Jesus. Jesus did not end his parables with "God bless America." It is not historical, and it's not constitutional. So why doesn't this resonate for people if we just tell them these things? What makes this so difficult? So there is a debate that happens frequently, and it started maybe, 20, 30 years ago. Were we founded as a Christian nation? Did the founders have some idea that this country was being built on Christian principles? So those of us that don't want a Christian nationalism future have a tendency to say, no, we were not founded as a Christian nation. You'll hear things like our founders were, Thomas Jefferson was a deist, and we get into the weeds of the belief systems of our founders. So I don't think that argument is terribly helpful, because we simultaneously need to understand the ways that Christianity was formative in the colonial project that led to the founding of the United States. Christianity was formative in how the people who were on this land were acting, were treating other people, were creating their governments. So these are two different things. So to peel back this story of Christian nationalism, we are going to go back in time a bit and start with the doctrine of discovery. Who has heard of the doctrine of discovery? A good number of people. Who heard of the doctrine of discovery when they were a child, when they were growing up? Who learned about this growing up? 3 hands. I did not learn about the doctrine of discovery growing up in my history books. The doctrine of discovery is a series of papal bulls that were in the 1490s period. You're good? Did somebody say something? Okay. Was in the period of the 1490s, a series of papal bulls that gave permission and justification for Portuguese and Spanish explorers who encountered people living in these lands to steal land, to commit atrocious acts, because those they encountered, if they were not Christian and they were not civilized, then they weren't human. So this was written in several papal bulls. The most notable is in 1493. And this justification and ideology didn't only remain in the Catholic Church and an old Catholic, how many papal bulls are there? How many papal bulls do people think about on a regular basis? This had a profound effect, and it moved beyond the Catholic permission structure to those philosophers, Puritans, other religious refugees who were coming to this land. If those they encountered were not Christian, they saw themselves as superior and those as inferior. And this assumption is woven into, I would argue, it's woven into every element of our society that still ripples through today. And this art piece was done in 1590, depicting Christopher Columbus discovering America in 1492, and it was actually hammered in metal. And what do you see in this story that was told about Christopher Columbus and the explorers coming to America? You all can even, I know there's people online, but what are some of the things that you see in this picture? A crucifix. We see a crucifix in the background being lifted up. I see people who are naked or in loincloths, uncivilized, savage. Was the language that was used as showing gifts while they are bringing things. There's other people in the background running away, scared. These stories, this is the first way that Christianity and colonial logic were formative in developing what would become the United States of America. Now, this doctrine of discovery was used in 1823 in legal precedent through a Supreme Court ruling, Johnson versus McIntosh, to justify the taking of indigenous lands. And at that point, it became case law. So they were calling upon, in 1823, in the U.S. Supreme Court, a 1492 papal bull that said if someone wasn't Christian or civilized, then they had no right to the land. And so just, keep thinking about that and how that is shaping this story. The next moment that I think is important to talk about as we trace this thread of Christian nationalism is this picture. Does anybody recognize this picture? Yep. This is a popular American Progress. This is the traditional story of manifest destiny. Now, manifest destiny as a phrase was actually first coined by someone, John O'Donohue, in a newspaper where he was actually being critical of this ideology. But the ideology itself was that the Christian people are the chosen people who have come to the New Jerusalem. They are chosen to come to this land and to populate it from sea to sea. So what else is happening in this time frame, 1823 to 1860? Americans are moving west. This is the period of westward expansion. So to justify the actions of Christianizing, converting people to Christianity in order to control indigenous people, taking their land, Christianity and this idea that we as Americans are exceptional and chosen and have a divine right to use and exploit land and people, empowered people and inspired and motivated actions. Now, this is complicated because we all know that a lot of our traditions and our Christian traditions were on that mission field, were pioneers who were planting congregations across the West where we are today, who were helping to serve the poor, care for the needy. There was a lot of narrative around the beneficent efforts of these Christian explorers. Yes. Okay, can we dim the lights a little bit more? Let's see if we can get that. I wonder if this light is causing the problem, maybe? The high ones? All right, they're figuring it out back there. We're working on it, so I'll keep talking while they work on it. Thank you for letting me know. So this ideology is woven into how we see ourselves, how we've built our communities, how we see other people. It's, of course, not the only story. During this same period, there are indigenous people. There are people coming from different lands, coming from the West. You understand that there is always a diversity of people and lives and experiences and religious experiences happening in the United States. And we've all heard this narrative, right? Anyone not heard this story since they were a kid? So then the next period, did we get better lights yet? No. They're doing their best. We're working on it. We're working on it. Hey, there we go. Good job. Thanks. Is that better? Wonderful. Especially for this one. You need the details for this one. All right, so we have gone from doctrine of discovery to manifest destiny and westward expansion. So now we are to the 1860s. What's happening in the 1860s? The Civil War. So in the Civil War, one, we know that both people in the North and the South claimed their Christian, that they are the Christians and the Americans that God loves. God is on the side of the South, God is on the side of the North. Both are claiming that they are the blessed and divine in this fight. Also, we know that in the South, they're using the Bible to justify slavery, claiming that it is their freedom and their right to enslave free labor, exploited labor. In the North, there are, people also claiming that they are in the right. There are abolitionists who are working to end slavery, to free enslaved people. All of these folks are using the same text, the same motivation, as they are the ones who are divine and blessed. After the Civil War ends, there is this, of course, great divide, healing that needs to happen, repair that needs to happen. And we have the period of Reconstruction that has been put forth by Congress to try and make right those who were enslaved, who are going to need a lot of support and to make right for the harms that have been done to them. So this is being debated in Congress, how to do this. We also have people from the North who were abolitionists, who are church folks who want to go to the South to support the education of formerly enslaved folks, who want to try and repair. Well, this doesn't last long. Within 20 years at the most, these efforts fall apart, as we know. And one of the factors that gives people a sense of righteousness, even as they are letting go of the idea of actually repairing the wrongs that were done with slavery, part of the ways that they justify this to themselves is through putting efforts into repairing the relationships between the white Northern and Southerners. What happens when you're focused on repairing the relationships between the white Northern and Southerners? The formerly enslaved people are left aside, and we experience the rise of Jim Crow laws and segregation, and those who were opposed give up. Those who are entrenched continue to feel empowered. And this picture is Moody preaching at a revival in 1876. And Moody was a known evangelical preacher who had a lot of influence, especially over political figures, and had a presence in the North and a presence in the South. And at first, he was a strong abolitionist. And he was known for having, his school was in Chicago, and he would have integrated classes of students, and he was on the front lines for abolition. Before 1890, he had given up and was starting to take money from people in the South who wanted them to come and start schools in the South, but if they had schools in the South, they had to be segregated. And so at first he just gave in to that fight, and then eventually he embraced the racist rhetoric and ideology of segregation, and that rippled across a lot of the religious world that just came to accept segregation and the separate but equal ideology as part of God's will. And so this is another just pivotal point when we see the actions of the church and churches broadly and Christian communities continuing to hold up this hierarchy of who has value and who doesn't have value. Okay, now we're going to jump ahead 50 years. I know I fly a little bit in this. So we've passed World War I, World War II. A lot is going on with those times as well, but we're focused on this shifts in Christian nationalism. So this picture is of kids in school doing the Pledge of Allegiance. So the time period that I want to talk about is the 1950s, and specifically the Eisenhower administration. So in 1952, there was no under God in our Pledge of Allegiance. There was no in God we trust on our money, on our bills. We did not have people saying, God bless America, at the end of every speech as we do today. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, who was a devout Presbyterian and part of a mainline Christian tradition and movements, was inaugurated on January 20th of 1953. 2 days later, he was baptized at the National Presbyterian Church. It was the first time they talked about, this is the first time we've had a president baptized in office. So he has this religious fervor and starts to enact prayer every time they start a congressional hearing. He wants to make "In God We Trust" the national motto. So in rapid succession, they have the first National Prayer Breakfast, which you might have heard of the National Prayer Breakfast because it still goes on, and it's known now as a, most of the time, more conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical type of event. In 1952, at the first National Prayer Breakfast, it was put on by the National Council of Churches, which is a mainline body of denominations, all of such are sponsoring this event and that I'm a part of. They said it was a coronation of Eisenhower at the 1953 National Prayer Breakfast. I said 52 was the election. 53 was when this is all happening, right after the election. So soon after this, there is a desire to add "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, it's also important to note that the Pledge of Allegiance hadn't really even been a thing until about 40 years before this. It was during the wars that the Pledge of Allegiance became a thing, but it didn't have "under God." So in 1953, the Congress votes to add "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. They also vote to make "In God We Trust" the national motto, and to add "In God We Trust" to the dollar bills. So often, how often have you heard these things have been there forever? This is part of who we are. These are only about 75 years old, these ideas and these institutions. One of the things I think is most fascinating about this time is that it was mainline Christians that were merging Christianity and state during this time. What was happening in many of our churches in the 1950s? They were growing. I know how many church buildings have I been in when I go, oh, this was the building that was built in the 1950s. How many churches have an add-on that was built in the 1950s? There was a fervor and a growth and a real pride. Now, there were some other things happening in the 1950s. Does anybody think of any of those? The Cold War. You got one? Were you going to yell it? You're going to have time for Q&A too, so we can get some interaction. I love to interact. It's hard for me not to. So the Cold War was happening, and we are fighting communism. And what is communism? Godless. What are we going to be? We are going to be for God. We are going to be under God, a nation under God, not godless communists. So this brings a real sense of identity and pride and national unity during a time when that was seen as countering communism. And this is all post-World War II, and we know if we think about our own families, what the memories that are mixed up during that time period. So after the 1950s come what? The 1960s. We have this pendulum that swings, right? So the 1960s get here, and we have the election of JFK, which there's also a lot of really fascinating work out there about how JFK, especially as someone who was Catholic and having to prove his bona fide as a faithful American, talking about God and country in very much the same ways that Eisenhower was and that politicians do today. So the 1960s, though, we have JFK, we have civil rights movements, we have Selma, this picture is of Selma, we have Martin Luther King Jr. and the bus boycotts and the student nonviolent movement, and we have upheaval in challenging our social order and our institutions and our cultural norms around gender and sexuality and race and so many of the things that we're still wrestling with today. And then we have the Vietnam War. And so this is really seen as this, breaking through of challenging so much that had been assumed in the 1950s as being a common identity. So here comes the rise of the religious right. So the religious right, actually, it's important to say that had been forming before Reagan for at least 20, if not 25 years. And we can even trace some of the 1950s religious fervor that was on the more hardened fundamentalist end that starts to become the movement that becomes the religious right. I was just at the archives for the LBJ library doing dissertation research, and I came across a 10-page pamphlet that was put out by the National Council of Churches that was a warning about the religious right and fundamentalist Christianity, and it literally could have been written today. It was wild, and it was written in 1965. So I want to be clear that these seeds were forming and present. But with the election of Ronald Reagan, these groups that might have been fringe before, does anybody know who this is on the right? Jerry Falwell. These movements that might have been fringe, like Jerry Falwell's Liberty University, who are refusing to desegregate their universities and being threatened with having their tax exempt status taken away. These groups feel seen for the first time in Reagan. And Reagan comes in and brings these fringe groups of evangelicals into the fold, and some moderate mainline Christian traditions as well, and brings back this more tightly ingrained God and country that they had experienced in the 1950s. So at this time, we know now that these groups were thinking strategically, and they were thinking long-term, right? And we have seen that most recently in the Supreme Court ruling on the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade, and the way that Samuel Alito uses religious justification for his opinion in the Supreme Court ruling. And these are there are justices who were a part of this effort that started 50 years ago to bring their ideological vision of America into the institutions. And as we know, that's continuing, right? But still, this idea, I think during this time, there's this assumption of God and country. And there's this feel that it's always been this way, even though it had really only been that way in the 80s. It had been that way for 30 years. But I think that part of what we're experiencing now is the ripple effect of still the 80s, the 50s, 70s, 80s of it's always been this way. We have always said, God bless America. We have always said one nation under God. We have expected a national prayer breakfast. We have come to assume so many of these things. And then it's gotten ratcheted up. So in this next slide, I'm bringing us to Obama. We, of course, have George Bush, and we have the Iraq War and 9/11, which we could also point to those threads of major events where there's this coming together of God and country for some who really hold on to that identity. But I want to talk about Obama and President Obama and the Black Lives Matter movement, because I want to frame our current moment as a bit of another backlash. As we saw the backlash to the 1960s with the rise of the religious right? I think that part of what we are seeing now is another backlash to culture change and challenges to the status quo, to the order of power that so many had become accustomed to, who were experiencing privilege and assumed position in American society, and tying that to God and country. So, when we have Obama say things like the people in rural areas clinging to God and guns, we all know what he was talking about. But of course, the backlash to that was people feeling like they were being dismissed or not seen, and their identity is tied up in that God, guns ideology. And then, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, and this picture is from 2014, and I know that everyone here knows that the Black Lives Matter movement was really born after Michael Brown and the protests of 2014, and so often we keep framing it in the 2020 George Floyd. This has been, of course, like other movements, been happening for a long time, but this becomes a flashpoint for those who see their order as threatened, see the way that things should be as being challenged. And then we come to really the 2014-2015 as Donald Trump enters the stage as a candidate for president. We all have heard the scene a million times and seen it coming down the escalator and making horrific statements about immigrants and dividing people. But what does he use to bring those together who support him? God and country. That he is the one who can bring together, who is, Christian, appropriate. And I wanted to put the picture of the upside down Bible. That's my favorite. But he brings this idea that, we are returning to the way things should be, where we say God, we put our hand over our heart and we say under God in our pledge, where we are the country that is focused on this social order that has been there since the beginning, our founding fathers, our Christian story. So he's pulling on all of those narratives that we've just gone through and taking that this is who we are as Americans, is we are white, we are Christian, and we are Republican, and this is what it means to be American. And as that language gets ratcheted up, we all know that it has emboldened folks who are further to the right, who are okay with violence if it means serving the righteous goal that they have, their vision, that they're under threat, so they are going to, they're willing to use violence. And this was so clear, these merging, when I don't know if you remember sitting there on January 6th, watching the news and watching the TV and seeing people flooding, and I mean, it was just so disorienting. And then to see crosses being used to bash in windows or to threaten people, and to see these signs, Jesus is my Savior, Trump is my president, you can't merge these ideologies any more than that. And so we have seen it become ratcheted up. And this is where you see the God and Country film that you saw last month, that we have been there's been research that's been happening a lot over really since Trump was elected. Before that, Christian nationalism was an idea that was known, of course, but it wasn't a phrase that we were all talking about, right? So the Public Religion Research Institute has been doing a lot of research, as well as Pew, as well as several scholars, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, among others, who have found that roughly 3 in 10 Americans qualify as Christian nationalist adherents. That adherents is about 10%, or sympathizers, and the sympathizers is about 20%. Now, 30% is kind of wild. But one of the questions that I've been asking a lot is, like, where is that line between the God and those who grew up with this idea that God and country, they had a flag at the front of their church. They, on Sunday morning, are singing on the 4th of July and Memorial Day, they're singing national hymns. Where is this line between those who are willing to, one, change our political systems to institutionalize one particular narrow Christian ideology, or to use violence to push forward their ideals, and those who like a good barbecue at church with God Bless America, it's a fuzzy line for some. At the national level, all the research shows that Christian nationalism is strongly linked to Republican Party affiliation and linked to holding favorable views of Trump. Also the research says that Christian nationalists are more likely than other Americans to see political struggles through the apocalyptic lens of revolution and to support political violence. And there's actually another study came out last week by PRRI that's really digging into these questions around willingness to use violence, because of course that's where we start getting nervous. But here's where I want us to spend some time thinking. Yes? So we'll do question and answer with a microphone in just a minute, and I'll have you ask that then, because the work. We're almost there. So the last point I have here is that Christian nationalism affects all of us. One of my concerns right now is that it's really easy to say that's them. That, it's those Christian nationalists. It's easy to do that. But we are so seeped in the United States, in Christian communities, in these little ways that our faith has been tied to our national identity. And I think that especially in our churches and for leaders who are leading churches that are more purple and churches where they have congregants who are, someone at a talk I recently gave said they have a congregant who says, this was always sung as a kid, and when I hear this national hymn, it makes me think of my family, and I feel good. And so how do we reconcile with, one, this reality that it's less black and white, it's less us and them. This has been with us for a long time. And also, how do we understand and how does it change the way we approach Christian nationalism when we realize the influence that the mainline Christian church has had in merging God and country? Like, there's an element of, we created this as mainline National Council of Churches affiliate. Where we are now, of course, is different than the ways that Christian nationalists are taking this, but how can we use that to help us learn how to address it? Might there be some lessons there that can help us counter the ways that this movement is growing with a sense of compassion and honesty? So these are some of the questions I'm wrestling with. All right, 2 quick more slides. We're there. I can't even remember what time it is or what I'm supposed to be finishing or where I am, Clover, so you remind me. Okay, good. All right, so here's a few books. So I mentioned, this hasn't been talked about that much, and then now all of a sudden everything you see in here is about Christian nationalism, right? And there's several reasons for that. One, it's important, it matters. We're seeing it in our policies. We're to the Supreme Court, to the schools, to the legislatures. We are seeing fights that are rooted in these 2 competing worldviews. One that is Christian, one narrow Christian ideology should be institutionalized from our healthcare system to our education system to our Supreme Court. The other is rooted in a constitutional democracy that values pluralism. And these are different visions, so we need to be paying attention. Here's some books. There are so many more, and I have a resource list. I know that there's a few of those out there that we can get to you for learning more. These are some of my favorites. Taking Back America for God is kind of one that really gets into the research. They're sociologists, so if you're a sociologist, you like the numbers, that's a good one for you. White Evangelical Racism, Althea Butler, she's also been talking a lot on this and really gets into the ways that racism is so woven into white Christian nationalism. And then Robbie Jones, who leads Public Religion Research Institute that I've talked about, is that bottom one. And then The Power Worshippers, she traces the kind of the growth from the religious right into what we're seeing now. What can we do? I told you I would not leave you just scared, but I would leave you feeling empowered, right? So here's some things. I think one is learning, finding those trusted media. I actually learned from our audience at one of the talks I gave recently, Ground News. I'm loving it. It's a way to be able to see how different news sources are being influenced and how news stories, so ground news. Follow trusted media. Follow scholars of religion, history, and politics, such as the ones I've named, who are really, moving beyond. We, I think, have such a tendency to just look at right now, and history has so much to teach us. Follow organizations that are tracking the growth of white Christian nationalism, like Christians Against Christian Nationalism, that is by the Baptist Joint Committee. Vote the Common Good, Americans United, Interfaith Alliance. Also share and advocate. So the more that you talk about this, like I did at a bar in New Orleans, see, I was doing it, raise awareness of how Christian nationalism, what it is, and add that level of complexity. as you're doing, join other Christians in becoming educated, as speaking, and advocate and stand with those groups who are the most impacted. This, I'll say again, advocate and stand with those groups who are the most impacted by these policies. One of my other concerns is that by focusing on white Christian nationalism, then we're giving more air to those who are causing so much harm. Pay attention to those who are being harmed, who are being excluded, who are dehumanized through this worldview of white Christian nationalism. All right. Thank you. Q&A, so. Oops. Can I email, do we have a registration list of? We can put it on our website. Yeah. Perfect. Yep, I can get you these slides. I can also get you a printed out sheet of resources for the webpage.
Great, thanks. So you are open to Q&A, and we do
Yes.
encourage you must speak into a microphone because it's live streamed, and people on the live stream will not be able to hear you. So Terry, you want that side, and I'll take this side.
Just raise your hand if you have a question.
We have a lot of questions. We're going to compete for sides. Hold on.
And thanks for hanging with. We covered a lot of ground.
That's great.
There was that
600 years.
gentleman right there had a question.
Okay. You used the word apocalyptic before. I'm not asking for a definition of that. But I wondered, it made me wonder about if you could tell us more about the connections between fascism and white Christian nationalism. I think apocalypticism plays into that, but...
Yeah, I can do my best. I'm not an expert on fascism, but what when I have on there that it's an apocalyptic worldview, that there is this existential, that it ratchets up, that we're not just here for a fight, but we know that things are going to go on. This is life or death. And it institutes this fear because, and I think that that's part of fascism as well, is that you are pushing fear into people to control their behavior, right? And so that's an element of the white Christian nationalist ideology, is that this is a fight between good and evil, and we must win by any means. And that is where things get dangerous. Hopefully that helps. I can get back to you with some resources. Yes?
Okay, I just have to say I'm a native New Orleanian, so I know about those bars.
Wait, say that again? I couldn't hear you.
I'm a native New Orleanian.
Oh, you know about the bars. Good, good.
And my comment about the slide before was I love that the topic said white Christian nationalism, and that seemed to be left out of that other slide because the white part is very, very important in
Yes.
acknowledging how we got here, and people are wanting this to be a white country.
Absolutely.
And that's what I just think it was missing from that one particular slide.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that Jamar Tisby's going to be here next, because he'll be certainly getting into that. But they are inseparable. And I hope that, pulling that through the doctrine of discovery as well, because it's tying on the same logic that justified slavery and genocide and land theft. This is the same logic.
Hi, so my question is, In the 1950s, when they started adding "In God We Trust" to the money, was that around the same time that the tax code was shifted to allow tax-exempt status to religious institutions, or is that a separate thing?
I need to look at that to make sure, but I think that is when it started. But now you're making me, I'm going to go back and look and see if that was also under Eisenhower. But I mean, during that period of time was when the institutions became merged. So great question. I'll find out. There's somebody
Okay,
back there.
over here.
Oh, yes, thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a great presentation. And we were just remarking on these three remarkable women who are kind of running the show here. I'm wondering if, Dr. Henderson, you could speak to the sex and gender politics and how they're rolled into white Christian nationalism.
Yeah, great question. Kristen Dumez has written a book called Jesus and John Wayne. And she has another book coming out about specifically white Christian nationalism and gender. So watch for that. I'll put that on the list. But they are very much bound. And that gender roles and the roles of women are a part of the ideological framework. And that's, I think, when we look at the 1960s, why that also leads to the rise of the religious right and the ways that women's reproductive rights became so focused on, while most people who have heard about the history of abortion rights know that that first emphasis on abortion rights was actually related to racism, and Liberty University and other Christian schools not wanting to follow desegregation laws, and were upset that the tax codes, that they were going to be losing their tax-exempt status, and so they found that abortion was something that people mobilized around. And so they moved the emphasis to women while they were also acting on racism. So yes, they are connected.
You spoke about the connection to education, and I'm very involved in education, and we're really feeling it with book banning and other things. And one of the things that everybody can do pretty soon is vote no on Amendment 80. I put some literature on the table there because that is really being driven. It's supposedly school choice, but really it's about giving public money to religious schools and deteriorating public education, taking money away from public education to move toward a Christian, more Christian educational system. So I'll be glad to talk to anybody about that, but get the flyer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, that is one of the, I talked about these different fights, the ways that this is popping up right now, and these book bans, history curriculums, sex education in schools, public money being used for private religious education through vouchers, or charter schools that are now petitioning as religious charter schools. This is where these battles are playing out. And when I named that this is a strategy that has been working for 50, 60 years, to move people into offices on school boards, in city councils, in local politics, where often people aren't paying attention to who is running. The voting rates are really low for those offices. And so folks who were able to embed into those spaces and push a far-right ideology, many of them don't even have kids in the schools who are pushing these ideologies. So thank you. Thanks for the work you're doing, too.
To follow up on your question about gender roles and male power structure, how do you pronounce it? Kristen Dumez? She just yesterday started streaming a 30-minute video called For Our Daughters. I just watched it today. Yeah. So anyway, For Our Daughters.
For Our Daughters, just coming out. Yeah, we're trying to get her to interview her on our podcast on that video. So yes, thank you.
So my understanding is that churches like St. John's and Montview are fairly healthy churches, And so I'm wondering is what is at stake for them to take a stronger position regarding separating God and country, or say separating God and country matters, making that a more prominent part of their teachings. I'm wondering, is it more than just losing 3 out of 10 of their congregation members?
I couldn't hear your question very well. So you're asking what's at stake for congregations as there's this rise happening?
Especially churches that are fairly healthy. I understand
As churches
small
that are
churches
healthy,
really
yes,
struggling.
yes. Okay. Well, I think one is there's an invitation to ask questions. You know, there was a comment at the beginning that we don't talk about religion and politics. We don't talk about politics in church. And I get that in the way that I don't want someone from the pulpit telling me how to vote. But the facts are that politics is about life. It's about our life together. It's about our systems. It's about our neighbors. It's about our children. And so, I mean, I know that Montview and the congregations that are here, you are all talking about that. But asking the questions, what does it mean to be faithful when our neighbors are suffering? What does it mean to be faithful as we ask questions around abortion rights? What does it mean to be faithful? So creating spaces to be able to talk about these things is the best way that we can counter this narrow ideology, because it festers in the dark, right? That it's by not talking about it that this one ideology becomes assumed and dominant. For churches that aren't Montview and healthy churches like you're a part of, they're seeing a lot of, I'm hearing from pastors and friends who are in more conservative congregations that they feel like they're losing their congregants to right-wing news and propaganda, and that they are choosing that over the gospel or over the stories that they're telling, that their competition is this media that's making a whole lot of money off of them. So it's an uphill battle and there needs to be more conversations about it.
Aristotle defined ethics and politics in ways that are clear. He defined ethics as the question of how an individual ought to live their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Politics is the question of how we ought to live our lives together. That's politics writ large. Politics writ small p, is the backroom stuff that goes on as we work through our differences.
Mm-hmm.
And when we use the word politics, often it's the latter one that is focused on, not the primary one. So in the churches, in Christianity, in Baha'i, in Judaism, the question is always, how ought we to live together, as well as how ought we to live our lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. And it is big and small issues. We got a question back there?
I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about the segregation that exists in Christianity and how it has paralleled the rise of white Christian nationalism. I've often heard it said, as I was growing up and witnessed, that Sunday mornings are the most segregated hour of the week.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about the difference between advocacy and allyship and actually being in the work and being an accomplice, how do we achieve that in light of these two separate tracks of Christianity that exist?
Great question. So on one hand, I mean, we know the history of the ways that white Christian nationalism created this split, the racial split in our churches. But now, today, how do we deal with it now, right? Because we can't go back in time. And one of the difficulties on the ground is, well, I want to worship this way, and I want to feel comfortable and be in community, and asking, black folks who've been worshiping their way to go to a white church and white folks to go to a black church. it becomes really complicated because there's our personal experiences. But the part that makes me the most concerned is that for white churches, it's so easy to not see the ways that whiteness is tied up in Christian nationalism if you're only around other white people, and if you're only having those conversations among other white people in churches. And so it's complicated and difficult, and you have to be intentional today. We have to be really intentional to break down those barriers that we have both self-created and have been institutionalized into our neighborhoods and our housing and our schools and our churches. And so it takes a level of work and openness. So many I know here have been doing programs around facing racism and understanding the way race is shaping us and our communities. But when it comes to white Christian nationalism, it's that encounter to be able to see it in different ways that we miss when we don't have racially diverse communities that are worshiping together. I was going to say one more thing about that, but it just slipped my brain. It'll come back. Thank you for the question.
Could you say more about how the ideas of salvation and redemption connect to white Christian nationalism?
Okay, so the question is, how do ideas of salvation and redemption connect to white Christian nationalism? So I think
like
that
the Speaker of the House saying we believe in redemption around here.
Say that again, redemption on what?
The Speaker of the House, was it yesterday or today, says, well, we believe in redemption around here.
Oh. I'm holding my snippy comments. Aren't you proud of me? I think that, as you look to those earliest stories of the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny and this American narrative that we have created as white Christians, speaking specifically of who we are, that we are saving those who are less fortunate, those who weren't born as a white Christian in America. We are redeeming that is that beneficent sense of self, that it's not the same kind of salvation and redemption that is written about in the scriptures. It is a salvation and a redemption that's more about power than about looking in the mirror. But it is so deeply embedded in our American story, and that's where it gets picked up in white Christian nationalist ideologies. Awesome.
Other questions? All right.
I remembered the one other thing I was going to say about the race issues.
Do it.
One of the interesting things that they have found in studying Christian nationalism, so we talk about white Christian nationalism, yes, and there is also a phenomenon of Christian nationalism in Black communities and Latino communities, and that it isn't, it's different. It has a different shape, and in immigrant communities, it has a different shape than white Christian nationalism, but when they do the sociological studies, they will get responses to questions that are seeing themselves as, that the United States is a part of a divine plan, that there is a sense of national identity that is tied to faith for people who are not white. The white Christian nationalism has a different nature in the level of, one, violence, the level of instituting hierarchies, and becoming embedded in our institutions. But that's one of the interesting phenomenons that come up in the research about Christian nationalism at large.
Terry, yeah.
Can you say something about religious intolerance as part of this movement?
Yeah, so one of the pieces that I did not, just because there's so much in this topic, that I think has really shaped where we are today is the changing demographics in the United States religiously. So after 1965, and this is what I just did my dissertation on, so I'll try and keep it down a notch because I get a little excited. So the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act opened up immigration in the United States from non-European countries. So before that, it was very, very difficult, very, very limited immigration from Asia, Africa, India, even Southern Europe, Italy, Poland. After 1965, there were new pathways. They were still rooted in racist ideologies. I should just note that. But it opened up the opportunity for people to come to the United States who were Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, Baha'i. We have a much more religiously diverse U.S. population now, and then, of course, the religiously unaffiliated numbers have gone up. But that is also a perceived threat to white Christian nationalist ideology. It also challenges the categories of religion. That's a whole nother talk. We'll plan that. But they are connected, and I mean, you see it as well in anti-Semitism in the white Christian nationalist movement and Islamophobia. So, yes.
I just wanted to see if you could speak to the patriarchy and the origin of the patriarchy being, in my view, in one sense, a distortion of Jesus' original message, because he never was a savior. He never said he was a savior, but the Christian people who came later needed to make him that. And so the patriarchy is built into Christianity from the very beginning in the distortion that the church has propagated all these 2,000 and some years. So I think the tension in my mind is between the patriarchal structures and the more feminine face of God, and that accounts for the deep struggle that we're in this country, and those, the polar opposites.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing to is the theological problems in this logic of white Christian nationalism, and absolutely white Christian nationalism is, as we talked about with gender, and patriarchy is a part of it. It's been part of it since the founding of the United States and the colonial enterprise. But I think what you're bringing up too is how can digging into some theological questions be entry points to be able to have conversations with folks about our assumptions, about what Christianity is, about how our Christianity is bound to our identity as Americans. So yeah, that's how I would respond to that. Thanks.
Hi, I'm curious about the conversations that you had in the bars.
They were pretty great.
How did you approach it? What do you say that was so well received? I mean, I think we could all use some practical wording on how to have that conversation.
So I'm happy to share because it was so, I mean, my friends were laughing at me and entertained. But So here's the scene. My friend from New Orleans over here will understand. So I'm gluten-free, so it's really hard for me to find food. I had not been able to eat at the previous place. We found a taco place. I was overjoyed. So I walked up to just this bar, and I was trying to order a taco. There were two guys sitting next to me. One of them was on a phone with his girlfriend, and so I was making jokes. They were light. I could tell they were relaxed. So I'm just talking to them. We started talking that they were in town for the Saints-Eagles football game. We started talking about football a little bit. Then we started talking that one of them has a kid in college in Mississippi. We started talking about their kids a little bit. And then I said, y'all are from, and they told me that they go on a trip once a year to a football game, and they're truck drivers. And so they come through Colorado. We have a conversation about that. And I said, you live in Pennsylvania. Are you getting just crushed with political ads? And they're like, yes. And I said, are you going to go? Which way are you going to go? You know, I just made it light. And they said, Trump. And I said, really? And he was like, I can't stand the guy. And I said, well, then why would you vote for him? And he said, because I think that we're about to go to World War III, and I think that Trump is so unpredictable that he will scare the other people from going to war. That's what he told me. And then the other guy said, I don't like him either. I can't stand him, but our economy was better then. And so I pushed back, and I was like, you know, and so we had some banter. And at the end, they said, and then I told him, my friend said she has a degree in religion and a PhD in religion and politics, and they said, what? And they said, she's a pastor, and they said, what? And so we were just, you know, and then at the end, we literally hugged, and they said, thank you so much. We never have conversations like this. I bet. Actually, one of them said, I'm not going to vote, and I said, that's fine. But then the next conversation I had actually was at another, there's these rooftops where you can look down, and there's lots of groups of women friends there, and so that made it easy to connect. And so it was a group of black women friends, and I said, and they told me they were from Georgia. And so I said the same line, like, are you getting inundated with political ads? And she said, yeah, but it's going to go our way, isn't it? And I said, I hope so. And then I found out she was a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and we talked about and she was smoking a Swisher Sweet cigar, by the way, and I was like, ugh. And she's a professor at Johns Hopkins and supporting Kamala. So it's those little moments, if you can break down, you know, and making it first the small talk, and then just little entry points. And for me, that was an entry point to be able to ask people, are you getting inundated with political ads? Because it's something we can all, no matter which position you're in, it gets annoying after a while.
Okay, we're going to do one more. One last question.
I just need to know if there is any hope that we will be able to hold the true meaning of Jesus' life, or do you think Christian nationalism is going to swallow it all up?
I think that's a question for all of you. And I always, you know, one of my go-tos is that we come from a long line of people who have been persecuted or marginalized in one form or another. And even the Christians of the early Christians, you know, that the world doesn't typically work out all the ways that I want. And yet we keep on moving, and we keep on loving, we keep on finding points of connection, we keep on pushing for greater freedom, liberty, connection together, support for one another. So, you know, I think it's still fringe. I think the more we can stand up and speak out, it might get harder before it gets easier. But I don't know. I'm not. That's not where my hope lies, I guess. It lies in relationships and connection.
Can we all give Amanda a big round of applause?
Thanks.
We
Thanks
are
to you all.
so thankful for everything that you've brought to us this evening, and so grateful for your work and your small conversations.
Thank you.
My
Thanks to
name
you all.
is the Reverend Terry Hobart. I'm the rector at St. Thomas. I'm part of this coalition, and we are so grateful that you have all come tonight. I was recently reading how Martin Luther King Jr. had reframed the question around the Good Samaritan to say that we should not be asking, what will happen to me if I stop, but what will happen to him if I do not stop? And I think we can reframe the question around this topic as well. What will happen if we do not talk about it? And so I urge you all to continue to read, to learn, to talk about it. Dr. Henderson has very generously offered to send some resources and her slides. Our coalition has a curated resource page on the web. It's housed at the St. Thomas Denver website, so you can go there, and we will get her resources up and added to that as soon as she sends them to us. And we do so hope that you join us again in a month on October 26th. It's a Saturday morning, so not a Friday night, but a Saturday morning, October 26th and October 27th, to spend time with Dr. Jamar Tisby. Thank you all for being here tonight.